Montana Territory, 1867. The howling wind rattled the windows of the Emerson homestead as Rebecca Emerson cradled her newborn daughter against her chest. 19 hours of labor had left her exhausted, her nightgown still damp with sweat despite the bitter cold that penetrated the cabin walls. "A girl," her father-in-law muttered, turning away from the bed where she had brought new life into the world. His voice carried no joy, only bitter disappointment. "Another mouth to feed that won't pull her weight." Rebecca looked down at her daughter's perfect face, counting 10 tiny fingers and marveling at the wisp of dark hair crowning her head. How could anyone look at this miracle and feel anything but wonder? "Her name is Sarah," Rebecca announced, her voice stronger than she felt. No one acknowledged her words. Her husband William stood in the corner, arms crossed, his face a mask of frustration. They had been married 2 years, and in that time, she'd learned how desperately the Emerson men wanted an heir, someone to work the land, to carry on the family name, to justify their brutal struggle against this unforgiving wilderness. "The land needs strong hands," William's mother said, her voice brittle as the ice forming on the windows. "Not another woman to drain our supplies." Rebecca pressed her lips to Sarah's forehead, inhaling her sweet scent. "She's perfect," she whispered, though no one seemed to hear. That evening, as the blizzard reached its peak, William entered their small bedroom. Rebecca's heart sank when she saw the bundle of clothes in his arms. "You need to leave," he said flatly. "Father says there's no place for you or it anymore." Rebecca clutched Sarah tighter. "William, please," she begged, tears welling in her eyes. "The storm will die out there." His eyes, once warm with love during their courtship, now held nothing but cold resolve. "Then that's God's will." "How can you say that? This is your daughter." "I needed a son," he replied. "This family needs a son." "Give me until morning," Rebecca pleaded. "Just until the storm passes." William shook his head. "Father's decision is final. You have 1 hour to gather your things." 1 hour later, Rebecca found herself thrust into the raging blizzard, her thin coat offering little protection against temperatures that had already claimed 2 lives in the settlement that week. She had nothing but a small bundle of clothes, a blanket for Sarah, and the cross necklace her mother had given her before she journeyed west as a hopeful bride. The door closed behind her with finality, cutting off the cabin's warmth. Rebecca stood frozen for a moment, the shock of her situation overwhelming her. The wind howled around her, snow already accumulating on her shoulders and hair. "Please, Lord," she prayed, her words stolen by the wind. "Not my Sarah. Take me if you must, but spare my child." She tucked Sarah deeper inside her coat, trying to transfer what little body heat she had. The baby had fallen silent, perhaps sensing the gravity of their situation. Rebecca took her first steps away from the only shelter she'd known in this territory, each footfall sinking deep into the accumulating snow. The storm was disorienting, a white void that erased all landmarks. Rebecca had no destination in mind, the nearest settlement was miles away, an impossible journey in these conditions. She simply moved away from the cabin, each step heavier than the last. The snow was already knee-deep and rising. When she fell the first time, she forced herself up, panic giving her strength. The second time, her legs refused to cooperate. The cold had penetrated to her bones, numbing her extremities and clouding her thoughts. "Stay awake," she commanded herself. "Sarah needs you." Crawling now, Rebecca spotted the hollow of a fallen tree ahead. With the last of her strength, she pulled herself toward it, seeking any shelter from the relentless wind. The hollow was barely large enough for her body, but she squeezed inside, curling around Sarah. The baby had stopped crying, a worrying sign. Rebecca loosened her coat with trembling fingers to look at her daughter's face. In the dim light, she memorized each perfect feature as darkness began creeping into the edges of her vision. "I'm sorry, my love," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm so sorry I couldn't give you more." She pressed her lips to Sarah's forehead, feeling the faint warmth there. At least her daughter was still alive, still fighting. Rebecca pulled the blanket tighter around the tiny body, trying to create a cocoon of warmth. As consciousness began to slip away, Rebecca thought she glimpsed a shadow moving through the storm. A tall figure, approaching through the swirling white. Hallucinations, she thought, the mind's final comfort before death. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the cold that now felt almost warm as it claimed her. Tahote had been tracking a wounded elk for 3 miles when he first noticed the unusual trail in the snow. No animal moved like this, the desperate, staggering path of a human near death. As a Cherokee who had fled west after losing his family during the government's forced relocations, he had learned to avoid white settlers. Their fear and hatred of his kind usually meant violence. But something pulled him along this trail. The spirits were guiding him, he felt certain. When he found the woman and child tucked into the hollow log, nearly buried by drifting snow, he understood why. The woman was barely alive, her lips blue, her breathing shallow. The infant, miraculously, still lived, protected by her mother's dying body. Without hesitation, Tahote knelt and lifted them both. His cabin was 3 miles away, a journey that would test even his strength in this storm. "Live," he commanded in English, one of the few words he spoke in the settler's tongue. "Live." He cradled the baby inside his fur-lined coat and lifted the woman over his shoulder. The storm fought him with every step, but Tahote was determined. These lives had been placed in his path for a reason. He would not fail them. The journey back to his cabin was a battle against nature itself. Twice he lost his way, having to stop and orient himself by feeling the direction of the wind. His legs burned with effort as he pushed through snowdrifts that reached his thighs. The woman's weight seemed to increase with every step, but he refused to rest. Hours later, Tahote finally reached his cabin. He laid the woman on his bed of furs near the fire, which had burned down to embers. Working quickly, he built up the flames, then turned his attention to his unexpected guests. The woman's clothes were frozen stiff. He removed them efficiently, wrapping her in dry furs. Her skin was dangerously cold, her fingers and toes showing the white patches of severe frostbite. The baby, protected by her mother's body, seemed in better condition, though her tiny hands and feet were cold to the touch. Tahote prepared a broth from dried meat and preserved roots he had stored for winter. He spooned small amounts between the woman's blue lips, massaging her throat to help her swallow. For the baby, he soaked a clean cloth in the broth and let her suck on it, providing both nourishment and hydration. Through the night, he worked tirelessly, applying poultices of herbs to the woman's frostbitten extremities and keeping the fire blazing. By morning, color had returned to the baby's cheeks, though the woman remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored. Tahote fashioned a cradle from a wooden box, lining it with soft rabbit pelts. He placed the baby inside, near enough to the fire for warmth but not so close as to be dangerous. Then he returned to the woman's side, continuing his silent vigil. Hours later, Rebecca awoke to unfamiliar sensations, warmth, the crackling of a fire, and the gentle weight of furs covering her body. Panic seized her as she realized Sarah wasn't in her arms. "My baby," she cried, struggling to sit up despite the pain that shot through her limbs. A man appeared from the shadows, tall, with copper skin and eyes dark as obsidian. His presence should have frightened her, but something in his calm demeanor eased her fear. Without speaking, he gestured to a small bundle in a makeshift cradle near the fire. There, Sarah slept peacefully, her color healthy, her tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Rebecca collapsed back onto the bed, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Tahote nodded once, then returned to the fire where he was preparing more broth. He brought her a wooden cup, gesturing for her to drink. The warm liquid revived her further, bringing sensation back to her limbs, along with the pain of severe frostbite. "Who are you?" Rebecca asked, her voice hoarse. "Tahote," he replied simply, touching his chest. Rebecca, she responded in kind. And my daughter, Sarah. He nodded, acknowledging their names. Rebecca noticed how he moved with quiet efficiency around the small cabin, his actions purposeful and precise. This man had saved their lives, taking them into his home without question. Over the next days, Rebecca drifted between consciousness and feverish dreams. Whenever she woke, Tahote was there, silently tending to her needs and caring for Sarah with surprising gentleness. He applied poultices to Rebecca's frostbitten extremities and fed the baby a mixture of broth and herbs when Rebecca was too weak to nurse. When fever finally broke, Rebecca realized with horror that she couldn't move her left foot. Tahote's expression told her what words couldn't: the damage was permanent. "Will I walk again?" she asked, fighting back tears. Tahote nodded slowly. "Different walk. Not same." He demonstrated with his hand, mimicking a limping gait. Rebecca turned her face away, absorbing this new reality. Not only had she lost her husband and home, but now she would be permanently marked by that night in the blizzard. How would she care for Sarah? How would they survive? As if reading her thoughts, Tahote spoke again. "You stay. Heal. Safe here." His broken English carried more comfort than the most eloquent sermon Rebecca had ever heard. She looked at this man, this stranger who had risked his life to save hers, and felt something she hadn't expected: trust. "Thank you," she said again, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. February gave way to March, and the brutal cold began to ease its grip on the land. As Rebecca's strength returned, she began to understand the silent language of her rescuer. Tahote spoke little, but his actions revealed a soul of profound compassion. She learned he had lost his wife and son to smallpox years before. The small beaded moccasin stored carefully in a wooden chest told a story her heart understood without words. His gentle handling of Sarah spoke of a father's remembered touch. Rebecca taught herself to stand again, then to walk with a pronounced limp. Tahote carved her a walking stick from ash, decorating it with intricate symbols she later learned represented strength and renewal. "What do these mean?" she asked, tracing the carvings with her finger. "New life," Tahote explained, pointing to a spiral pattern. "Strength," he added, indicating another symbol. Their first true conversation happened over a month after her rescue, when Rebecca found him outside, watching the sunrise. "My husband's family cast me out because Sarah was a girl," she said, breaking their companionable silence. "They needed a boy to work the land." Tahote was quiet for a long moment before responding. "My people, children are sacred. Boy, girl, no difference. All gifts." The simple truth of his words broke something inside Rebecca. She wept openly for the first time since her ordeal, releasing the shame and rejection she'd carried. Tahote stood silently beside her, a solid presence against which her grief could break like waves against stone. That night, he taught her to say, "Wado, thank you" in Cherokee. It was the first of many words she would learn. Spring arrived with explosive green and wildflowers that transformed the landscape. Tahote showed Rebecca which plants could heal, which could nourish, which could harm. He taught her to fish in the stream that ran near his cabin and to identify animal tracks. When Sarah cried with colic, he showed Rebecca how to prepare a tea that soothed the baby's discomfort. "The land speaks," he told her one day as they worked in the small garden he had helped her plant. "You must learn to listen." Rebecca nodded, understanding more than just his words. She was learning a new way of being, one that connected her to the earth rather than fighting against it as the settlers did. By summer, Rebecca's hair, once kept tightly bound as a proper settler woman's should be, hung loose down her back, lightened by the sun. Her skin darkened, her hands grew calloused from work, and her spirit strengthened with each passing day. Together they expanded the garden, Tahote showing patience when Rebecca's inexperience led to mistakes. When she successfully harvested their first vegetables, the rare smile that transformed his face was worth every blister and sunburn. "I never thought I could do this," Rebecca admitted, looking at the bounty they had coaxed from the earth. You are stronger than you know, Tahote replied, his dark eyes holding hers. Sarah grew strong, crawling across the cabin floor, reaching for the colorful mobile Tahote had made from feathers and polished stones. He carved wooden toys for her, singing Cherokee lullabies when he thought Rebecca wasn't listening. What does that song mean? Rebecca asked one evening as Tahote rocked Sarah to sleep. It tells of the stars, he explained. How they watch over children, keep them safe. Rebecca watched his gentle hands cradling her daughter and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. This man, who owed her nothing, had given them everything, shelter, protection, and now a sense of belonging she had never felt before, not even in her husband's home. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, Sarah balanced on wobbly legs between them, holding a finger from each of them for support. She belongs to both worlds, Tahote said softly. Rebecca looked at him, recognizing the unspoken question. Yes, she answered. As do I, now. That night, she moved her sleeping mat beside his. Autumn painted the forests in bright colors, and with it came the first true test of their newfound family. Hunters from a nearby settlement, tracking deer, stumbled upon the cabin and the unlikely trio that inhabited it. That's a white woman living with an Indian, one man hissed to another, not realizing Rebecca could hear them from where she gathered berries. The three men confronted Tahote as he split wood outside the cabin. Their hands hovered near their rifles, their faces twisted with assumptions and prejudice. Did he take you, ma'am? The oldest hunter called to Rebecca as she emerged from the trees, Sarah on her hip. We can escort you back to civilization. Rebecca stood tall despite her permanent limp. This man saved my life and my daughter's when my own kind left us to die. There is more civilization in his silence than in all the words I've heard from white men's mouths. The hunters exchanged uncomfortable glances. It ain't natural, one muttered. Leave our home, Rebecca said firmly. You're trespassing. Tahote stood silently beside her, his hand finding hers. You've gone native, the youngest hunter spat. What would your husband say? My husband cast me out to die because I gave birth to a daughter instead of a son, Rebecca replied, her voice steady. Tahote saw value in both our lives. Which man would you respect? The men retreated, but Rebecca knew this wouldn't be the end. That night, she and Tahote spoke of difficult choices. We could go west, he suggested. To the mountains. Fewer people. Rebecca considered the life they'd built, the garden now yielding its harvest, the solid walls of the cabin Tahote had constructed with his own hands years ago. No, she said finally. This is our home. I won't be driven away again. Tahote studied her face in the firelight. It will be difficult. White men, they fear what they don't understand. Then they should try to understand, Rebecca said. I did. I learned your ways, your words. Why can't they? Fear is easier than learning, Tahote replied with the wisdom that had guided him through his own losses. Rebecca reached for his hand. I'm not afraid anymore. Not with you. The simple declaration hung between them, weighted with all they had come to mean to each other. Tahote brought her hand to his lips, a gesture he had never made before. Together, then, he agreed. Winter returned, bringing with it memories of the terrible night that had nearly claimed Rebecca and Sarah's lives. But this year, the cold brought no fear, only the comfort of being enclosed together in their warm cabin, watching snow blanket the world outside. Rebecca had prepared for the season, preserving food from their garden and learning from Tahote how to smoke meat and fish. Their cabin was stocked with firewood, dried herbs hung from the rafters, and furs lined the walls for additional insulation. Last winter, I thought I would die, Rebecca said one evening as they sat by the fire. Now I've never felt more alive. Tahote nodded, understanding. The greatest strength comes after the hardest trials. Rebecca watched him as he worked on a carving, his strong hands moving with precision. Those same hands had carried her through a blizzard, tended her wounds, taught her to survive, and eventually, held her with tenderness she had never known before. "What are you making?" she asked, nodding toward the piece of antler bone he was shaping. "You will see," he replied with a rare smile. "When it's time." Sarah took her first steps on the winter solstice, toddling from Rebecca to Tahote with a triumphant giggle. They had decorated the cabin with evergreen boughs, a tradition Tahote explained was to honor the enduring life force that persisted even in winter's grip. "Look at you!" Rebecca exclaimed as Sarah wobbled across the floor. "You're walking." Tahote knelt, arms outstretched to catch the little girl if she fell. His face, usually stoic, broke into a wide smile as Sarah reached him and collapsed against his chest. "Strong like mother," he said, looking up at Rebecca with pride. That night, after Sarah had fallen asleep, Tahote presented Rebecca with a gift, a necklace bearing a pendant carved from the antler bone he had been working on. Inside was a perfect miniature of the three of them, rendered with painstaking detail. "My heart," he said simply, placing it around her neck. Rebecca touched the pendant, tracing the tiny figures with her fingertip. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like our family," Tahote replied. Their love was not one of grand declarations or passionate displays. It lived in the daily acts of care, the way Tahote always rose first to stoke the fire before Rebecca's feet touched the cold floor, how Rebecca learned to prepare foods that reminded him of his childhood, the shared glances over Sarah's head as she discovered some new wonder of the world. It lived in the stories they shared at night, Rebecca's tales of her life before coming west, Tahote's memories of his people's traditions. It grew in their shared grief for what they'd lost and their shared joy in what they'd found. As winter deepened, they created new traditions that honored both their backgrounds. Rebecca taught Tahote Christmas carols, and he showed her the Cherokee winter dances. Sarah absorbed it all, her developing mind embracing both worlds without the prejudice that divided them. "She will be special," Tahote said one night as they watched their daughter sleep. "A bridge between peoples." Rebecca nodded. "She already is." When spring returned again, the hunters did not reappear. Perhaps they had spread word of the strange arrangement at Tahote's cabin, or perhaps they had simply forgotten. Either way, Rebecca and Tahote were left in peace to continue building their life together. They expanded their garden, Tahote teaching Rebecca more advanced techniques for growing food in this challenging climate. Sarah toddled between them, delighting in the feel of soil between her fingers as Rebecca showed her how to plant seeds. "Gentle," Rebecca instructed, guiding Sarah's tiny hands. "Just like Tahote showed us." The little girl looked up at the man who had become her father in every way that mattered. "Tahoe," she said, her first attempt at his name. Tahote froze, then knelt beside her. "Yes," he said softly. "Tahote." "Tahoe," Sarah repeated, beaming with pride at her accomplishment. Rebecca watched them, her heart full. This was not the life she had imagined when she came west as a bride, but it was infinitely more precious than anything she could have dreamed. Summer brought new adventures as Sarah grew more curious about the world around her. Tahote taught her to identify bird calls, showing infinite patience as she tried to mimic the sounds. Rebecca marveled at how naturally he had taken to fatherhood, his stern features softening whenever Sarah was near. "You were meant to be a father," she told him one day as they watched Sarah attempting to catch minnows in the shallow part of the stream. "I was meant to be her father," Tahote corrected, his eyes never leaving the little girl. "And yours." The simple declaration warmed Rebecca more than the summer sun. She leaned against his shoulder, grateful for this unexpected life they had built from the ashes of their separate tragedies. That evening, as they sat outside their cabin watching the sunset, Rebecca stood and walked to the edge of the clearing. The limp from her frostbitten foot was still pronounced, but she had learned to move with grace despite it. "I used to pray for death that night in the snow," she told him, looking out at the land that had once seemed so hostile but now felt like home. "Now I pray for 100 more years with you and Sarah." Tahote joined her, Sarah balanced on his hip. "The spirits answered both prayers," he said. "They just knew which one to grant." Rebecca smiled, touching the pendant at her throat. Some might call their family strange or wrong, but she knew the truth. Love speaks not in society's expectations, but in the quiet language of souls that recognize each other across all divides. Sarah reached for her mother, and Rebecca took her in her arms. The three of them stood together as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, a family forged not by blood or convention, but by courage, compassion, and the choice to see value where others saw none. "Watto," Rebecca said to Tahote, the Cherokee word for thank you now as natural on her tongue as English. "Watto," he replied, his hand finding hers. And in that language of gratitude and love, their story was just beginning.